So I want to start with Act 1, which is the decision to intervene. So let me just give a little bit of background here first to understand how we got involved in Somalia. So the problem came onto the world's radar screen in January of 1991 when the longtime president of Somalia, Siad Barre, was overthrown, and the country descended into a civil war. So there was a power struggle among competing warlords as to who would succeed him. And the conflict that ensued was really quite damaging to the people of Somalia. There were large levels of internal displacement as people fled the fighting. And most prominently, there was a famine brought about by the disruption of agriculture, by banditry by different warring, militant groups, and the deliberate use of food as a weapon by rival warlords who would try to restrict the supply of food to areas controlled by their rivals. In response to this conflict, the United Nations got involved and brokered a ceasefire in March of 1992, and in April of that year established the UN operation in Somalia, or UNISOM, which was a peacekeeping mission which went in with the goals of trying to monitor the ceasefire and to try to prevent a resumption of fighting there. But the problem that UNISOM faced was that one very prominent warlord, a man by the name of Mohammed Farah Aidid, his power base was in Mogadishu, and he didn't want the UN there. And so his forces harassed the UN operation and made it difficult for them to operate. He was sitting in control of the airport and port in Mogadishu, and hence he could make life very difficult for UN peacekeepers. So at that point, the UN turned to the US for help. The US up to this point had been donating food and money to humanitarian organizations operating in Somalia. But as the crisis worsened, we were being pushed to take on a more active role. In the summer of 1992, then President Bush heard a really devastating briefing from the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, in which he learned that a quarter of the population of Somalia was at risk of starvation, that a quarter of all children under 5 had already died, and that 800,000 people were internally displaced or refugees, and the prospects were for that number to increase. So in August of 1992, President Bush responded by announcing an airlift. We would start airlifting and dropping food to Somalia and to refugee camps in Kenya. And so over the next several months, the United States would fly over 2,500 missions carrying 28,000 tons of relief supplies. But while this was helpful, it quickly became apparent that this was not going to solve the problem alone. That without some significant military force on the ground to help deliver the food to needy people, and without the cooperation of Aidid, that the food wasn't going to get where it needed to go. And so in November of 1992, ironically during Thanksgiving week, President Bush sat down with his advisors to think about what US options might be. And it was at this time that Bush decided that the United States would assist the UN, and it would do so by going in very strong. That is, on the order of 20,000 US troops going in as part of a multinational operation. So he makes this decision in November. On December 3rd, he asks the UN Security Council to authorize member states to use military force to secure this delivery of aid and relief supplies in Somalia. A resolution is passed on December 3rd. The next day, December 4th, Bush declared that 28,000 US troops would be sent to Somalia as part of the United Task Force, or UNITAF. And their mission there would be to secure the port, secure the airport, and then help deliver food around the country. And that led on December 8th to the deployment of US Marines to Mogadishu. And here we get another classic image from this conflict, which is our Marines landing on the beach there, shielding their eyes from the flashbulbs of all of the media and cameras that are taking their pictures. Okay, so the US has gotten into Somalia. How do we understand this decision? Why did President Bush decide to go in? Well, it's already suggested that the main argument that people made was that we can understand this with respect to a phenomenon known as the CNN effect. And the CNN effect refers to the idea that media coverage might drive foreign policy decisions. Specifically, in this case, that coverage of the tragedy unfolding in Somalia, beamed into people's living rooms, generates a public demand for intervention. And then politicians Elected politicians, by their nature, have to be, to some extent, responsive to public pressure, responded to that demand to do something by initiating a military operation. So that, like I said, that's the conventional argument that sprung up in the wake of this decision. And I want to suggest that it's entirely wrong, and that all of the components that you would need for this argument to be right are not there. So the first point to make, and this is going to be evident on the next two slides, is that if you actually look at the amount of media coverage of the crisis in Somalia, it's simply not the case that Americans were inundated with images of starving Somali children in the lead up to the conflict. So this figure here is showing you from data from CNN how many stories they ran on Somalia and how many minutes of coverage they spent on it. And as you can see in the kind of the summer and fall of 1992, there's only sporadic and minimal coverage. There's an enormous spike of coverage when, well, in December, after President Bush announces that US troops are going to go there. So while it is true that there eventually was enormous coverage of Somalia, this coverage followed the presidential decision. It did not lead it. The second thing that I can show you in terms of evidence is that there's no evidence from public opinion polls that there was a great deal of pressure to get involved. I searched and searched for every public opinion poll I could find that even asked whether people were following the issue in Somalia or whether we should get involved, and it was actually very hard to find them. I'm showing you the results from one poll right here from September of 1992, when people were asked which of the following stories that had been covered in the past month had they been following most closely. And as you can see from this graph, number one by far is Hurricane Andrew, a hurricane which had just hit Florida. 51% said that. People were following the campaign. You got to start going down the list to find Somalia. Somalia is not even the number one foreign policy issue that people are paying attention to. You have no-fly zones being established in Iraq. You have a civil war breaking out in Bosnia. Sitting there at 2% are people closely following the civil war in Somalia, tied with scandals involving the Duchess of York and Princess Diana. And we didn't intervene there. Okay, so there's not much in the way of public pressure. And the final and I think most important piece of evidence against the CNN effect argument is that we have to recall when the decision to intervene was made. It was made in late November 1992, after President Bush had already lost his bid for re-election earlier that month. Okay, so we have a decision here made by a lame duck president, no longer needing to be responsive to public opinion. What's interesting here is that if Bush had thought that responding to the tragedy in Somalia would have been an electoral winner for him, he could have done it before the election, when it might have helped. But this was an election, as you may recall, where the key buzzword was, it's the economy, stupid. Bush had come out of the first Persian Gulf War very popular, but the economy fell into recession, unemployment spiked, his popularity fell. And in fact, before the election, a major foreign policy initiative would have been seen as a liability because it would have suggested that he didn't care that much about the suffering of Americans. Okay, so there's no evidence here that a politician responding to public pressure made this decision. In fact, it was made by a lame duck president, almost certainly thinking about his legacy, thinking about if he could leave office with a grand gesture, showing that he could do good in the world and that history would remember him for having done this. And so I think we need to place the decision to intervene quite squarely on the preferences of this one individual. So here's the first lesson that we take from this, which is that in general, US presidents have not seen humanitarian intervention as a political winner, nor have they generally been pushed into it by public pressure. Though the public is often sympathetic to these operations, and that sympathy can generate a permissive environment for a president to undertake this kind of operation, they are not compelled by public pressure to do so. Right? And that's most striking in this case, a decision made by a lame duck president. And I just want to point out that we see this again 6 years later when President Clinton, also as a lame duck, with his last election behind him, with the impeachment hearings behind him, decides to mount a major humanitarian intervention over Kosovo.